Hello, it's Balthazar3457. Today I'm going to bring you a short little video talking about the Katarina rework for League of Legends. Specifically, I'm going to be going over some points that the Champion Spotlight didn't cover or glossed over. Let's start with her Q. One of the most important notes is that her Bouncing Blade travels a lot faster than it used to. This is basically a buff since certain champions could apply shields preemptively. By having the blade move a lot faster, it'll be a more effective harass at lower level play, since it's basically a nerf to the warning people got when a Bouncing Blade was coming their way. It's also buffed because, for example, Malphite, if you would chain Bouncing Blades at him at low level, his Granite Shield could pop back up and absorb your harass before another blade reached it. And with the projectile speed increasing, this helps with those situations. A problem with Bouncing Blades is that the damage has been reduced in return for the ability to apply a mark to an enemy. A lot of Katarina players were fond of using Bouncing Blade to hit an enemy and harass them from out of range. While you can still do that, and her blades will now hit 5 targets total at level 1, unless you can follow it up with an auto attack or a shunpo, it's basically a damage nerf. Since the ability to apply a healing debuff to Bouncing Blade has also been removed, it's also no longer useful at low level for countering healing potions in early laning phase. However, that said, you can now hit a little bit more reliably due to the blades prioritizing the nearest target. This will make it easier to calculate where the blade will land. There's a problem with that, however. Imagine you're trying to get a blade to an enemy. All he has to do is stay far enough away to not be prioritized, rather than having to stay out of the spell's bouncing range like before. For people facing experienced enemies that know how to counter Katarina, this could be considered a nerf just as much as it could be considered a buff, especially considering that minions can bunch up and drag a blade away from an enemy. Bouncing Blade now also triggers a mark on the target that can be activated much like Lux's passive, but I'll get to that later. Now let's talk about her W, Sinister Steel. This is the new spell. Sinister Steel has a very short cooldown, just under 4 seconds. That doesn't decrease as you put points in it like Bouncing Blade does. One of Katarina's weaknesses was that she could not last hit minions at range without using Bouncing Blade. Sinister Steel has enough range on it that you can hit an enemy melee champion when they're outside of melee range, and the cooldown is short enough that you could potentially use this spell as a substitute for last hitting with melee or Bouncing Blade. Since last hitting with Bouncing Blade can push the lane even when you don't want to, this might be a less destructive alternative. It can also be used to harass melee champions, since if you hit them with the edge of the spell, they'll be out of melee range. You can also trigger the mark left behind on Bouncing Blade. Remember I said I'd get back to that? One important thing to note is about how these two spells can work together with each other. When only counting the blade hitting an enemy, you have to keep in mind that the damage is reduced with each bounce, by 10%. However, each bounce also applies the mark to an enemy, and that mark does not take reduced damage. So if you shunpo into a group of minions that you just hit with Bouncing Blade, then hit Sinister Steel, you'll trigger a full damage from all of the marked targets with no reduction. This is very useful for upgrading Katarina's farming ability. An issue, however, is that even when Bouncing Blade is at rank 5, its cooldown is about 7.68 seconds. The Sinister Steel cooldown is 3.84, so 2 Sinister Steel casts in 7.68 seconds, for 1 Bouncing Blade cast in 7.68 seconds, without CDR. So over the course of a 15-second fight, you would get 2 Bouncing Blade rank 5 casts, or 1 rank 1 cast, and 3 Sinister Steel casts at all ranks. Right as Bouncing Blade at rank 5 is coming off cooldown to be used for its second cast, you'll be casting your third Sinister Steel at the same time. So how much damage does each spell do? Well, Bouncing Blade does more damage on its own, not counting the mark, than Sinister Steel, by default at level 1, with AP scaling at level 5. However, even with the mark, it doesn't do enough damage to reach 2 Sinister Steel casts. The longer a fight lasts, the more significant the gap is going to become. For a protracted engagement, Sinister Steel is going to be better at dishing out damage than Bouncing Blade. Another benefit that Sinister Steel has is a movement speed bonus that increases with each rank. When you hit an enemy champion with it, you gain a 12% movement boost for 1 second at rank 1, 44% at rank 5. This movement speed boost isn't significant in and of itself, because even at rank 5 it is only a 1-second boost. But it does make getting a Crystal Scepter a little more viable to get that melee hit off when an enemy is retreating. Do I think someone should max Sinister Steel before they max Bouncing Blade? Well, that depends. Technically, Sinister Steel does more damage, and for some champions it can be used to harass, but Bouncing Blade harasses better in general. Both of these spells are useful for farming and to apply marks to creeps, then combo with Sinister Steel will really help Katarina's farm. Katarina's always had toxic farming. To last hit most of the time early game was to push the lane even when you didn't want to, and to harass was to push the lane also. This is still in part the case, but it's not as bad. Do I think that it's better to max Sinister Steel first over Bouncing Blade? I can see it happening, certainly not all the time though. I think most of the time, for most enemies, the extra harass power of Bouncing Blade will make you want to max that before Sinister Steel. Why am I telling you this? Well, the official Riot Spotlight talked about having a lot of leveling options, so I'm saying what I think about it, because I don't think it was descriptive enough. That said, on to shunpo. Shunpo has over a 13-second cooldown at level 1 and a 5.76 cooldown at level 5. The Riot Spotlight mentioned that if you wanted extra mobility, consider maxing shunpo second. Well, let's examine what shunpo gives you. Shunpo's damage is lackluster compared to the other two spells. It has better AP scaling than Sinister Steel, but Sinister Steel's base damage is so high in comparison that it won't matter in the slightest. Technically, you could get enough AP to have shunpo do more damage than Sinister Steel, but that's so far off that by the time you get anywhere close to that, you'll be 50 minutes into the game, and have long since reached level 18. And at that point, the maxing order no longer matters. At the lowest cooldown, Sinister Steel still casts faster and does more damage. Shunpo, however, has the benefit of mobility, moving you to your target, and also grants a damage reduction buff for a few seconds. However, that damage reduction buff doesn't scale. At level 1, the same buff is granted as at level 5, with the same damage reduction and the same duration. This means that from a utility standpoint, it scales very poorly. If you use Shunpo for a special 3 seconds of extra defense at level 1, it'll be exactly the same as doing it at level 5. So, is it really worth it, maxing Shunpo before Sinister Steel? Well, technically you could cast it more frequently and be shielded more often by chain casting Shunpo at level 5, but if you max that first, you'll be missing out on valuable Sinister Steel ranks. And Sinister Steel, combined with Bouncing Blade, are Katarina's main farming tools and damage dealers. So is getting a faster shield cast worth harming your farming tools and damage dealing ability? Most of the time I'm going to say no. In League of Legends, a 5 kill streak can be stopped by a negative player who is allowed to free farm. I don't think that it'll be a better idea to max Shunpo over Sinister Steel, except in very special circumstances. Now on to her ultimate. First, to dispel a myth. It was mentioned in the Champion Spotlight that Azania could be used to help her wait for cooldowns. This may have given some people the impression that her ultimate can now be channeled while under the use of Azania's Hourglass. This is false, as demonstrated here. Another myth is that Katarina's movement speed was slowed. She retains the same 3-2-5 movement speed, but her running animation was changed to a walking animation, so that may have made some people think that she had her movement speed nerfed. That's not true. So, her ultimate. This is a complex situation. Her ultimate used to get a 15-second cooldown reduction per kill or assist. This has been reduced to a 10-second reduction. This creates a problem. For a long time, the argument used to suggest that her ultimate should be left interruptible from a balance standpoint was justified with the fact that Katarina could use it twice in the same teamfight if 3 enemy champions went down. That's no longer the case, and her ultimate can still be interrupted. If the team fight is quick and isn't a chase or a kite fight, it will still take 6 seconds of fighting and 4 enemy kills to be able to trigger a second ultimate cast without any cooldown reduction items or buffs. So the ability to use it repeatedly in a team fight has been nerfed significantly, and the spell can still be interrupted. Furthermore, there seems to be a slight delay between when the spell is cast and when enemies start taking damage. While this delay is very short, it's still an extra fraction of a second that can be used to interrupt Katarina's ultimate. Do I think that the slightly shorter channel duration is worth the 5 seconds per champion CDR loss? Well, it's hard to say, but it's worth mentioning to you. I leave the exact calculations to the expert theory crafters. Anyway, hopefully you liked this short information video, and it proved useful to you to get better understanding of how the new Katarina works. Feel free to leave comments or questions, and I'll see you next time. Laters.